Hey friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. So for today's chat, we are going to actually be leaving the United States and traveling to South Africa for one of the most insane survival stories I have ever heard of. Now, just because it's a survival story does not mean it is not horrific. It is violent, it is graphic, it is gruesome, but it involves one of the most badass women I have ever personally heard of. So if you haven't heard of the case of Alison Botha, then buckle up because I'm about ready to introduce you to Superwoman. So it's December of 1994, which is summer in South Africa, where our story takes place, specifically in Port Elizabeth. Alison had spent the day at the beach with her friends and the evening at one of those friends' apartments. When it was time for Alison to head back home, she stopped, got her laundry on the way home, and went back to her apartment. Alison ended up having to park further on from her apartment than what she was used to. And because of that, when she had parked the car, her fun ended very abruptly that night. She was met by a man who held a knife to her throat and pushed her over into her passenger seat. Now, the man assured her he did not want to hurt her. He said that he just needed to use her car for a few hours and that if she just sat there and let him borrow the car, everything would be okay. He told her his name was Clinton, and they began to drive. After a little bit of driving, the car slowed to a stop, and Clinton picked up another passenger who got in the back seat, another man. It was then Alison began to worry and didn't think that she was going to make it back home quite so easily. As the man was driving, the two men were talking back and forth to each other, and it was then Alison learned their real names. It was not Clinton who was driving. The man's real name was Franz, and the man in the back's name was Tiens. Now, when Franz ended up stopping the car, he stopped the car on a deserted part of town, just on the outskirts of town. I mean, past buildings, past everything. And when he stopped the car, he turned and looked at Alison and said, "Are you going to fight us?" And Alison, not knowing what her night was going to entail, just knowing that she was afraid, said, "No, I'm not going to fight you." Tiens got out of the car, and Franz proceeded to sexually assault Alison and to rape Alison. After which he got out of the car and asked Tiens if he wanted to do the same, which he did. Now, this was not the first time these two men had done something like this to women. In fact, there had just been a case a couple weeks ago against the two men, and before that, there was another case still. However, both these cases were reported to the police. So Franz and Tiens decided that this time, when they sexually assaulted and raped a woman, they were not going to leave her alive. They took the now naked and terrified Alison and threw her on the ground. While she was lying there, Alison would be brutally attacked by these two men. Franz would start in her abdomen area, specifically her pubic area, because he had even said during the attack that he was targeting her reproductive organs. And he would take a knife and begin to stab her. Between the two, her abdomen had been stabbed no less than 37 times. Once they were done with that, they moved up. She ended up being stabbed several times in the chest, and they would finish up by slashing her neck repeatedly, no less than 17 times, from ear to ear. After slitting her throat 17 or more times, they took her clothes and they threw them next to her. They left her there for dead. They got in her car and they drove away. And she should have been dead. Alison, however, was not dead. She was breathing. She was conscious. She said she felt no pain at that time, but she was aware that her breath was coming out in raspy, gargly noises. She was also aware that she felt wet between her legs. When she reached down to see why she was wet between her legs, it was then that she had discovered that she had been eviscerated. The stabbing to her abdomen had completely disemboweled her. So she reached for her clothes, pulled them close to her, and basically just scooped her guts in and held them to herself with her old t-shirt. At this point, Alison was pretty confident she was not going to survive. It was important to her for people to know who had done this to her. So she ended up taking her hand and writing in the dirt Franz and Tien's. And underneath her attackers' names, she wrote, "I love you, Mom." Now at this point, Alison herself says that she truly had an out-of-body experience. Like I said, she wasn't feeling any pain, but she felt herself leave her body from her own recollection. She felt like it was an out-of-body experience. And she said that at that exact moment, she knew that if she wanted to, she could give up and just let herself pass on. She knew her injuries were so severe that they were life-threatening, quite obviously. And in that moment, she knew that she could just let go and die. But in that moment, she decided that she was going to give it a try. She wanted to try to survive. So she brought herself back into her body and held the t-shirt close to her body to hold her insides where they were, and she began to crawl. She began to crawl because, like I said, they had pulled off and it was in a deserted area. They didn't even pull off on the road. So Alison's goal was to make it to the road because she knew if she made it to the road, there was a chance someone could see her. If she stayed where she was at, no one was going to see her before she died. It was dark, off the beaten path. She knew in order to survive, she had to make it to the road. So she just began crawling, holding her insides and crawling. However, after a few minutes of this, Alison recognized that this was not functional. Crawling while holding herself in was too cumbersome. It was very slow moving. It just was not working. So Alison made the decision to try to stand up and walk. And so she took all the strength that she had in her body to hoist herself up off the ground. And as soon as she stood up, her vision went black. And she was confused as to why now suddenly she couldn't see. So she reached up to see if she could find the problem. And the problem was pretty apparent. When she had reached up, her hand had gone completely inside of her neck. When they had slit her throat 17 or more times, they had cut through the muscle and the larynx of her throat and partially decapitated her. She was seeing black not because she couldn't see, not because her vision was wrong or there was an issue with her vision. She was seeing black because when she stood up, there was nothing holding her head straight, and it fell back and landed between her shoulder blades, and she saw black because she was looking up at the night sky. So, I told you, she's Superwoman. I cannot wrap my brain around what this woman went through, and it's a survival story, so just keep in mind that this woman ends up coming out on the better end of this. So what she ends up doing, she's holding her guts with one hand, and with the other, she grabs her head and hoists it back up onto her head, onto her shoulders, back into position, which you got to keep in mind. If it's fallen between her shoulder blades and the muscle's completely gone, I think I read somewhere an average human head with brain and everything is like as heavy as a gallon of milk. So she's like beaten and bruised and sore, and her guts are hanging out, and she hoists 8 pounds up one-handed to rest back on her shoulders, which 8 pounds doesn't sound like a lot, but I think given the circumstances would be a pretty challenging thing to do. But she does it. For the sake of survival, she does it. So now with one hand, she's holding her guts in. With the other hand, she's holding her head on. And at this point, she walks. And she just keeps walking and keeps walking and keeps walking until she makes it to the road. When she makes it to the road, she ends up just absolutely collapsing under the exhaustion and effort of all of that. And she's laying there thinking she could get hit by a car, but at this point, she doesn't have a lot of options. So she's laying there, and a car does pull up, and nobody gets out. They drive off. Sometime later, another car ends up pulling up, and this time they do stop, and this time they do get out, and it is a group of young adults who are there on vacation, and they see her, and they decide that they're going to help. Now, one of the people who got out of the car was a vet tech named Tian Aylard, and he was a young man, and he knelt down beside Alison, and he ended up taking her hand. He knew that what he was looking at was pretty severe, and his goal was to keep Alison grounded and to keep her conscious and paying attention to him. You know, you don't need to talk, but you need to stay awake. And that's what he did while one of his friends called for emergency services, which in itself is incredibly lucky, incredibly fortunate, because his friend had a cell phone. You have to keep in mind, this is 1994. Not everybody has a cell phone. It's pretty new technology, and Alison was so lucky that they had one on site. So they called for emergency services, and despite the hospital only being about 15 minutes away, it took the ambulance 40 minutes to get there. Alison stayed with Tian the whole time. He held her hand the whole time, got in the ambulance with her, held her hand the whole time before making it to the hospital and letting go of her hand for the first time. They stuck together through it all. After the whole ordeal, Alison would end up going through the timeline, and what she said was from the time that she was actually abducted to the time that she made it to the hospital was only about 90 minutes. So a lot happened in 90 minutes. And if you think about it, really a lot happened in about 50 minutes. If it took 40 minutes for the ambulance to get there and 15 minutes to get to the hospital, we're talking she was abducted, assaulted, raped, stabbed, left for dead, all within like a half-hour time frame. Horrible, but I mean, horrible. That's crazy. Upon Alison's arrival to the hospital, one of the first doctors to look at her was a doctor named Dr. David Common. And one of the first things that he noted, due to the severity of the injury of her neck, she actually was not breathing through her nose, through her mouth, through any of that. Because like I said, her larynx was completely severed. She was actually breathing through a penetration slightly above her collarbone in that general area, and that's why it was doing that rasping, gurgly sound that Alison remembers, because it was breathing through a gaping wound. Now, Dr. David Common would end up being joined by another doctor, Dr. Alexander Angelov, and the two of them would essentially be in charge of figuring out how to piece Alison back together. It would end up taking over 24 hours worth of surgeries to do that. Keep in mind, they have a very severe neck to deal with, some stabbing on her chest to deal with, a completely eviscerated abdomen where her intestines, remember, she was crawling on the beachy, sandy area. They found sand in her intestines, ash, glass. Like, it was a mess. She was very severely injured, and it would take some time getting her put back together. Now, what gets to the absolute insanity of this particular case? Both doctors who worked on Alison both said neither one had ever seen anything so brutal in all their years of working. They have never seen somebody come into the emergency room with such intense injuries, especially injuries that were inflicted by another human being. I mean, it's one thing to see somebody come in from a car accident or a collapsed building, but nothing like this before had they ever seen inflicted by another human. However, and this is what blows my mind, despite the brutality of what happened to Alison, the severity of what happened to Alison was very mild considering what she went through. And this is what I mean. When we start with her neck, like I said, at least 17 times across the neck, from ear to ear. It severed the muscles, it severed the larynx. She had been partially decapitated to the point where her head would rest between her shoulder blades if she was standing upright. In every sense of the word, I mean, she was basically decapitated halfway through. And so here is what I mean by it being absolutely brutal, but mild in matters of severity. So despite the fact that her neck was basically cut in half, the major blood transportation to her head and to her brain was undamaged, meaning her jugular was intact. Had that been cut, she would have bled out in minutes, but it was intact. She didn't bleed out. Despite her head being almost cut off, the major blood transfer system in your neck was unharmed. Another thing, every major nerve that runs from your brain to your major organs and your major organ functions, undamaged. Her larynx, unfortunately, like I said, it was severed, but her esophagus, completely intact. So yes, it's very brutal that her head was basically cut off. But once you get past the shock of the brutality of it, it could have been so much worse. And if it was worse, she wouldn't have been alive. But the fact that it missed everything that it missed, but still continued to be as bad as it was, like as brutal as it was, is amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Traveling down from her neck, like I said, she had been stabbed in the chest repeatedly. But the blade never touched her heart. She had multiple stab wounds to her chest, but not a single one to her heart. Which again is absolutely bananas. Going even lower, like I said, her pubic area and abdominal area was stabbed no less than 37 times. It was an absolute frenzy on her abdomen. But no organs were damaged. And despite the fact that she was eviscerated, dragged herself across the ground, had debris and sand and ash all torn up into her intestines, there was no infection, which is, it blows my mind. It absolutely blows my mind. How it's like it was a horrible situation, but everything that could have gone right in that horrible situation went right for Alison. She truly had a guardian angel that night, because it would be one thing if one of those things happened, like if they had cut her head off and missed the jugular, that would be a freak accident. But the fact that they missed her jugular, missed the nerves, missed the esophagus, missed her heart, missed all her major organs, and no sign of infection is nothing short of like a medical miracle. It's just crazy what she survived. Her lucky stars literally aligned for her that night to keep her alive. It was not her time to go. Her making the decision to survive, I mean, honestly, it just was not her time to go. Obviously, it was not her time to go. So once Alison got out of surgery, she would be introduced to the lead detective on her case, which would be Detective Melvin Humple. And he actually brought with him a book of like mugshots, previous criminals, and asked her if she could thumb through the book and point to anybody that she recognized, if she could find her attackers in the book. And not only did she find her attackers, she was able to write their names down and identify those attackers. And she identified them correctly because, like I said, they were using their real names in the car. And so Melvin would take that back to the prosecutor. Unfortunately, the prosecutor would say, it's great that she pointed to some pictures, but verbal would help so much in a case like this. Verbal confirmation is so much more effective, like in front of a jury, than just, pointing out a picture. And so Melvin came back and spoke with Dr. Common, the first doctor, and explained to him that they were really wanting a verbal from Alison. Now, the issue with this is because of the severity of her neck injuries, she had actually been intubated. Her whole neck is damaged and needs to be healed. So they intubated her, and she was still intubated. And Dr. Common was worried that if they pulled that tube out of her throat, they could damage any of that freshly sewn and sutured neck area. And so he was worried about that. So he sat down with Alison and told her his concerns and asked her opinion. What do you want to do? And Alison wanted the tube removed. And so they removed her tube. She took it like a champ because she's freaking Superwoman. And when they took it out, she said, my attackers were Franz and Tienz. And she verbally identified them. So Melvin actually did end up arresting the two. And when they had them in the interrogation room, Melvin had told them that they were being charged with attempted murder. And Melvin said when he mentioned attempted murder, the look on their face was genuine and complete surprise. And attempted murder? And Melvin said, you didn't kill her. She's alive and she's identified you. And so this is where it's just so unnerving to me. Franz responded by saying, then she's already told you everything. You don't need anything from me because if she's alive, she told you what happened. And he took a ring off of his pinky finger and handed it to the detective and said, you can give this back to her. It's her ring. And when the detective took it, it still had Alison's blood on it, which unnerving to me. Very, very sinister to me. So another thing that I learned when I was researching this was when you're preparing for court in South Africa at the time, when you're preparing for court and you have a victim who is identifying a attacker or an assailant or whatever, in order to prove that the victim identified that person in court, this sounds so ridiculous when you say it. I cannot imagine. But the proof is you would have the victim. So in this case, it would have been Alison. and you would have her come down to the police station, and the person that she is identifying, like let's just say Franz, would stand there, and Alison would be expected to put her hand on his shoulder and stay there and let them take a picture of her. And that was the proof presented in court of a victim identifying the person that they're accusing of this crime. Which, think about how traumatic that could be. Think about how horrible that could be. They didn't end up making Alison do that. They ended up going with the one-way glass, like kind of what you see a lot on like American sitcoms and stuff. That's what they use now, where it looks like a one-way mirror to the people in the lineup, and the person stands behind the glass and they say, "Oh, it's number 3 who did it." And that's what they used for Alison's case, and that's what they would end up using going forward. But that just means before that, they didn't do that. Can you imagine? I think it would be awful to have to face your rapist again, even if it's just like across the room in a courtroom. But can you imagine going down there and having to physically touch the person who attacked you long enough for a picture? I would be out of my, like, you wonder why things don't get reported. Like, really, you wonder why things don't get reported. I am sure there are a number of people who said, I don't want to go through with that. I'm going to keep it to myself and just hope it doesn't happen again. Because how traumatic would that be? But anyway, like I said, with Alison, they didn't make her do that. They did the lineup with the one-way glass, and that's how she was able to identify her 2 attackers. Now, after the arrest and before they would go to trial, Franz would actually end up trying to get a less severe charge, and he would do this by pretending to be possessed by demons and actually requesting a pastor to come in and speak with him because he felt like he was being possessed by demons. Now, this was right around the time of the satanic panic thing kind of going down, so it was something that kind of freaked a lot of people out. But when they brought the pastor in to talk to him and, kind of ask what demons he was getting possessed by, he didn't answer correctly. Like, he confused demons, and basically the pastor said he's faking. He if he was possessed by demons, he would know more correct information about the demons. So it was just a big ploy to just try to get off on a lighter sentence, like, hey, it's not me doing this, I'm being possessed. It didn't work. Now, Detective Melvin would actually end up being the one to take the 2 men to trial and escort them into the courtroom. And when he got to the 2 men, he specifically told them, I'm not going to be putting handcuffs on you. I'm going to let you walk unrestrained. And this is why. I hope you run. Because if you run, I have a chance to shoot you. And that's what I want to do, is to shoot you and kill you. So I will not be putting handcuffs on you. So you have that opportunity to run, and I have that opportunity to shoot. They didn't run. So the judge that presided over the case was Judge Jansen, and he ended up giving Franz 3 life sentences plus 25 years, and Tien's 1 life sentence plus 25 years. And the judge actually did something he said he had never done before and had never done since. And what that was he took the sentencing that he gave them and he personally typed it up alongside with a letter imploring the severity of keeping these 2 in jail. He wanted it on record that beyond even just the sentencing, his personal feeling was these 2 men do not need parole. These 2 men do not need to interact with people outside of prison ever again. That needs to be off the table for these 2 men. Now, in South Africa, the death penalty is considered to be unconstitutional, so that was never on the table. But Judge Jansen said that had it been on the table, he would have strongly considered it for this case, because this case was just so cruel and brutal and absolutely heartless. So, like I said, with the original sentencing, parole was not on the table. However, there was new legislation that was done in 2012, and what that legislation said that was anybody who had been in prison before then and had served 13 years and 4 months of their sentence would be eligible for parole. Fortunately, eligible does not mean guaranteed, and their parole has already been denied more than once. So hopefully they stay there until they die, because what they did was just absolutely awful. So Alison would end up going on to becoming a motivational speaker, talking about her story. She would end up writing some books on her story. And my absolute favorite part of the story was not only did she go on to conceive a naturally conceived baby boy and have a naturally delivered baby boy, but she would do it twice. She would end up getting pregnant, carrying her boys to full-term pregnancy and delivering them naturally twice, like 2 little boys, after the severity of the attack down in her abdomen and pubic area. There was no danger in her pregnancy. She had no risks. It was beautiful. And then the icing on the cake was at her second delivery. Do you remember that vet tech that had saved her on the side of the road? Well, that night literally changed his life too, because that's a pretty big thing to stumble across. And he changed courses. And he ended up taking 10 years, but he ended up becoming a medical doctor. And he was the assisting doctor on her second childbirth, which is so freaking wholesome. It is so heartwarming to see such a happy ending, and the two still talk and they're friends, and that is just so adorable. Isn't that just great? Like the fact that he was there for her on her worst day, and then he's there for her probably on one of her best days. It's just, it gives me goosebumps. Like, I don't know if you can see, probably not, but I actually have goosebumps from that, despite the fact that I have heard that multiple times in my research this past week. So usually when I start a story, I end up having tons of multiple different sources. And for this one, I did use several, but the source I leaned the heaviest on is a movie called Alison. And it's a short movie. It's only about 60 minutes long. And it is set up almost in like an interview style, but also has like a dramatic reenactment alongside it. But it's really cool because it's Alison herself, the real life Alison herself, is telling the story of what happened to her. And throughout her telling this story, it features the people who were involved in her story. The doctor, the judge, the detective, the vet tech. They are all interviewed for this movie. And so you get firsthand information about what happened to Alison from the people who were there to experience it. I ended up watching the movie twice, 2 nights in a row. The first time I watched it just to watch it. The second time I watched it with a notepad, and I took notes over everything, things that I didn't find online when I was doing my research, but I found through firsthand account from Alison herself, which is kind of cool. If you have Amazon Prime, it is free on Prime Video to Prime members, and that's how I watched it for myself. Now, when they were making this movie, Franz actually reached out to be in this movie, and he said that he would sit down for an interview, but he had 2 demands that needed to be met first. The first demand was that he insisted on having a letter written to him from Alison and signed by Alison, and it was supposed to be a letter of forgiveness. His second request was he had requested a backdated percentage of the money that Alison had made off of her motivational speaking and her book sales, because he said if it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have a story to tell and she wouldn't be making money off of a survivor story. Which, how freaking bold is that? You know what I mean? Like, how bold do you have to be to even suggest such a thing? So needless to say, he's not in the movie because his demands were denied. So Alison was 27 years old the night that she was abducted, and she is 53 years old currently right now. That night she chose life, and in doing so became one of the most badass women I have ever heard of in my entire life. And I just hope to have the strength that she has, because her story blows my mind, and I can't imagine going through half of what she went through and being as strong as she was as she did it. It's crazy to me. She's just amazing, amazing woman. But anyway, thank you guys once again for joining me for another chat and letting me get things out of my head and into your head. This case, though graphic, though brutal, though horrible, I do think is a nice difference than constantly talking about people who aren't survivors, who unfortunately were murdered or kidnapped and disappear without a trace. It's a little bit refreshing to have a survivor's story, despite the fact that she went through so much in order to survive. I'm amazed by her. Every day since I've heard her story, I have thought of her every day. She is truly an inspiration. And wow. I'm at a loss for words. I really am. I hope you think her story is as cool as I do, because I think her story is freaking amazing. So I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to top that story, because to me, that's probably my favorite story that I have told thus far. But I'm going to hop off here and go look for my next story. Here's a reminder before I go. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if you didn't do it at the beginning of the video, and then turn on your post notification bells. That's going to let you know the next time I sit down right here, as always, to have another morbid conversation. And I hope you'll join me. Until then, stay safe, take care. I'll see you then. Bye.